Babylon, 17 centuries before the birth of Christ, gleamed beneath a sun that never seemed to forgive. The walls shimmered with gold and dust, and from the towering ziggurat of Ishtar, the scent of burning myrrh drifted into the river wind. Within its temple, young women were chosen as the goddess's daughters, sworn to purity, silence, and endless prayer. They were honored in name, but forgotten in flesh. And when one of them dared to love, the city that had once called her sacred would turn her devotion into a death sentence. Inside the courtyard of the temple, the daughters of Ishtar knelt before the altar, their foreheads pressed to the cold marble floor. Each dawn began the same, the sound of bronze bells, the hiss of incense, the slow chant of priests. To the people of Babylon, they were the bridge between heaven and earth, pure vessels through which the goddess spoke. But to the women themselves, it was a life buried alive. Their hair was shaved to mark obedience, their names replaced by divine titles, their families forbidden to speak to them again. They spent their youth offering grain, oil, and tears to the goddess who never answered. The high priest told them they were chosen, but Ninsun, the youngest among them, felt the choice had never been hers. She remembered her mother's trembling hands as she was handed to the temple guards, her father's silent nod that sealed her fate. "Ishtar's eyes are upon you," the priest had said. Yet when Ninsun gazed into the torchlit statues that lined the sanctuary, she saw no eyes, only polished stone staring back. Each day she swept the temple floors and sang hymns to the goddess of love, knowing she would never be allowed to feel the thing she worshipped. At night, the silence pressed against her chest like a curse. Beyond the temple walls, she could hear laughter, the music of merchants, the faint cries of newborns, sounds forbidden to those who had given their bodies to the divine. The other priestesses whispered that the goddess rewarded endurance with eternity, but Ninsun longed for something more mortal. The warmth of a hand, the freedom to choose whom to love. She wondered if the goddess had ever envied her own creations. When a young scribe appeared at the temple gates to deliver clay tablets, Ninsun's eyes met his for a heartbeat too long. In that moment, something ancient inside her cracked. The bells still rang, the chants still rose, but for the first time, Ninsun heard the faint pulse of her own heart echoing louder than any prayer. The scribe's name was Etana, a quiet man whose hands were stained with clay and ink. He came each morning to copy the records of temple offerings, lists of grain, honey, and silver, gifted to the goddess Ishtar. The guards barely noticed him, for he carried himself with humility, eyes downcast, never speaking unless spoken to. Yet when his path crossed Ninsun's, something unspoken passed between them, a fleeting recognition that neither could explain. He was the first man she had seen who looked at her not as a holy vessel, but as a person still breathing beneath the weight of vows. Their first exchange was nothing more than a whispered greeting beside the courtyard fountain. He asked if the chants tired her voice. She nodded, unsure if she was allowed to speak. The next day, he left a small reed flower where he usually placed his scrolls. It was a reckless gesture, but the world inside those walls had long forgotten the language of kindness, and to Ninsun, that single flower was as forbidden as fire. She hid it in her robe until nightfall, pressing it against her chest while the other priestesses slept, trembling not from fear but from something she had never known being seen. Weeks passed, and their brief moments grew into quiet conversations between pillars or behind stacks of clay tablets. He told her about the city beyond the walls, of the markets filled with colors, of music that danced through the streets during the moon festivals. Ninsun listened as if he were describing another realm. For every story he shared, she offered one hymn, one secret thought she had never dared to voice in prayer. They began to meet when the sun set, beneath the archway that looked toward the river. The wind there carried the scent of reeds and burning oil, and for those stolen moments, the world outside the temple seemed close enough to touch. But Babylon was a city that heard everything. The priests trusted no silence, and the temple's walls had ears made of clay. When Ninsun lingered too long near the gates, eyes began to follow her. The eldest priestess, cold and sharp as the blade that trimmed their hair, warned her that desire was a serpent sent by the goddess to test devotion. "Do not listen when it whispers," she said. "It will drag you into the river, and the goddess will not reach in to save you." Yet each time Ninsun saw Etana, the warning lost its power. The goddess demanded purity, but Ninsun began to question whether purity without love was anything more than lifeless stone. One evening, As the last light faded over the Euphrates, Etana brushed his hand against hers. The touch was brief, trembling, but it shattered the stillness that bound them both. For the first time, she smiled, not as a priestess, not as a servant of the divine, but as a woman who had discovered her own pulse beneath the marble of Babylon. And the walls, though silent, began to listen. The dawn that betrayed her began like any other soft hymns, cold marble, and the scent of oil burning before the statue of Ishtar. Yet beneath the incense, Ninsun could smell fear. The temple guards moved differently that morning, their eyes flicking toward her and away again. Etana had not appeared at the gates, and when she asked the servant boy who brought water to the altar, he only bowed his head and whispered that the priests had summoned him before the council at first light. The world that had once seemed silent now roared with dread. She felt it in every echo of her sandals on the stone floor. By midday, the high priest's voice called her name. The sound struck her like thunder. Ninsun was led into the inner chamber, where the air was thick with smoke and judgment. The elders of the temple sat in a half-circle, their heads shaven, their robes dark as dried blood. On the floor before them lay the evidence of her crime, a wilted reed flower, and the faint impression of 2 sets of footprints pressed into the sand near the river gate. Her heart pounded as they accused her of desecrating the goddess's sanctity. To break the vow of purity was to defile Ishtar's house, and the law left no mercy for those who did. They asked if she denied the sin. Ninsun could not speak. Her lips trembled, but no words came. She thought of Etana, of his hands covered in ink and clay, of his voice whispering that love was not a curse but a gift. She wished she could believe that now. When she finally lifted her eyes, the priests were already writing her confession on a clay tablet. Her silence was their proof. The eldest among them rose, raising the sacred staff, and declared that her soul would be judged, not by man but by the gods themselves. She was stripped of her jeweled girdle, her ceremonial robe torn from her shoulders. Her long hair, which had grown since her initiation, was cut in a single stroke. The other priestesses watched from the shadows, their faces pale, their mouths pressed shut in terror. They had sung beside her, prayed beside her, and now they dared not breathe her name. The chant of condemnation filled the chamber, low and rhythmic, echoing like a heartbeat that refused to die. Etana was brought in next, his wrists bound with reed rope. His eyes found hers, filled not with fear but sorrow. When he tried to speak, a guard struck him across the mouth. Blood stained his chin, and he fell to his knees before the high priest. Ninsun wanted to cry out, to confess, to beg for his life instead of hers. But her voice broke under the weight of the moment. The high priest turned to the assembly and proclaimed the sentence that all Babylon would witness. Let the river decide. If the goddess forgives her, she will live. If not, her body will feed the current. And so the fate of love was left to the water. The river waited like a god with an open mouth. At dawn, the streets of Babylon filled with people pressing toward its banks, eager to watch divine justice unfold. The Euphrates shimmered with a cruel beauty, wide and merciless beneath the rising sunday. On its surface, petals from the temple gardens floated like offerings, carried by the slow current that would soon become a grave. Ninsun was led through the crowd, her wrists bound with coarse rope, her feet bare against the cold earth. The chants of the priests echoed behind her, a steady rhythm meant to summon Ishtar's gaze. Each step she took felt heavier than the last, as if the goddess herself were watching from the clouds, silent and waiting to see if her servant would drown. Etana was dragged beside her, his body bruised from questioning. His eyes met hers for only a moment before a guard struck him down. The priests declared that his crime was to tempt the handmaiden of the goddess, and for that he would share her judgment. The law called it the river ordeal, a sacred test of innocence known since the dawn of kings. The condemned would be thrown into the current. If the gods desired mercy, the river would let them rise. If not, their bodies would drift to the sea as proof of guilt. The high priest raised his hands toward the crowd and proclaimed that Babylon's purity depended on this offering. Let the goddess of love see what love has done, he said. His voice trembled not from pity but from power. 2 guards stepped forward, seizing Ninsun by the arms. She did not resist. The ropes cut into her skin, but she lifted her head, refusing to bow to those who had stolen her name. The people stared in silence. Some crossed their hearts in fear. Others whispered that perhaps Ishtar would spare her, for she had once been the temple's favorite. As she stood at the water's edge, Ninsun looked to the horizon. The same sun that once bathed the temple in gold now burned her eyes. She thought of her mother's voice, of Etana's laughter, of every prayer she had whispered into empty air. The goddess of love had demanded devotion, yet Ninsun's only sin was to feel the very thing the goddess embodied. She wondered if the heavens could ever understand the hearts of those who worshipped them. The gods lifted her by the arms and cast her into the current. The shock of the cold water stole her breath. The river closed over her head, and the chants became muffled echoes above the surface. For a moment she fought, her bound hands twisting, her lungs burning. Then, something inside her softened. She let the current take her, eyes open to the sunlight that rippled through the water. When her body vanished beneath the surface, the crowd gasped, and the high priest raised his staff toward the sky. "The goddess has spoken," he declared. But far downriver, where reeds whispered and the temple bells could no longer reach, the current carried a glimmer of gold, the broken chain from Ninsun's wrist, drifting like a final prayer that the gods refused to hear. That night, Babylon could not sleep. The river that had swallowed Ninsun roared louder than the drums of the temple, and a strange wind swept through the streets, scattering ashes from the altars. The high priest ordered more incense burned, claiming the goddess demanded greater offerings to cleanse her anger. Yet even as the priest sang, the temple's sacred flame sputtered and went dark. The people whispered that the goddess of love had turned her face away, not from the girl who had drowned, but from those who had condemned her. Fear began to seep through the city like smoke beneath a door. 3 days passed, and omens multiplied. The sacred doves refused to fly from their cages. A priest who had touched Ninsun's hair before her punishment fell ill and died before sunset. The Euphrates rose higher than it had in a decade, flooding the lower market where the poor lived. Mothers clutched their children as if the goddess herself might come to take them. The high priest ordered Ninsun's name erased from every tablet, her likeness shattered, her voice erased from the songs. He called it purification, but the more he tried to bury her memory, the louder her name spread in secret. Among the women of Babylon, a quiet rebellion stirred. Servant girls whispered her story in the corners of courtyards. Temple novices, when they bowed before the goddess, began to hide their eyes rather than lift them. Some said Ninsun had not drowned at all, that the river had carried her to the other side of the city where the poor worshipped her as a spirit of mercy. They built a small altar beside the reeds, placing flowers where her chain had washed ashore. No priest dared approach it, for the water seemed to darken whenever one came near. Etana was never seen again. Some said he was executed in the night, others that he vanished into the desert carrying her name on his lips. But his disappearance only deepened the legend. The people began to say that Ishtar had punished the priests by sparing the lovers' souls, binding them together beyond the reach of law or temple. For every curse uttered in the high chamber, a prayer was whispered beside the river. Babylon had built its glory on obedience. Yet a single drowned girl had taught its people to question who the gods truly favored. By the 7th day, the temple's outer walls cracked, as though the earth itself no longer wished to bear their weight. The priests redoubled their rituals, but the chants sounded hollow against the wind. In the silence that followed, someone no one knew who carved words into a stone near the riverbank. "The goddess does not need your cruelty." Washed clean by the current, but those who had seen them never forgot. For the first time in generations, Babylon began to fear its own devotion, and the name Ninsun passed from whisper to legend, from legend to truth. Centuries later, when the empire of Babylon had long turned to dust, a team of excavators dug into the earth where the Euphrates once roared. They were searching for gold, but what they found were tablets cracked, half-buried, and written in the fading script of kings and priests. Among them lay one small piece of clay no larger than a hand, its edges scorched by time. The inscription told of a nameless priestess, condemned to the river for breaking her vow to the goddess of love. The words were formal, carved in the cold language of law, yet something in the writing trembled like guilt preserved in stone. The scholars dismissed it as myth, but the locals who watched the excavation knew otherwise. They said the river still whispered her name when the wind came from the south. The diggers found her temple's ruins nearby, swallowed by earth and silence. Statues of Ishtar lay headless, their eyes shattered by time. One worker uncovered a thin gold chain, twisted and rusted green. No one could explain how it had survived the centuries untouched by decay. A woman among them descended from the same land, picked it up, and felt her skin prickle, as though the air itself were alive. That night, she dreamt of a girl with shorn hair standing before a river, her face calm, her hands unbound, her voice rising like a hymn. When she awoke, she refused to speak of it, but she buried the chain again, whispering a prayer in a language no one understood. In time, museums displayed the fragments of the temple under bright electric light. Visitors stared at the tablets without knowing the lives they once condemned. They called it history, not realizing that each mark of the stylus had been carved by hands trembling from the fear of gods. Yet those who lingered too long by the glass sometimes swore they heard faint weeping beneath the hum of the lights, a sound that came and went with the flicker of the bulbs, as though memory itself refused to rest. The story of Ninsun, the nameless daughter of Babylon, faded from official record but not from the soul of the land. Her defiance lived on in every woman who refused silence, every heart that dared to love against decree. The Euphrates still glides through the dust of its ancient city, carrying secrets that no empire could drown. When its waters shimmer at dusk, the locals say it is her reflection, not the sun, that glows upon its surface. Civilizations rise and fall, but cruelty disguised as faith endures, yet so does remembrance. In the ruins of Babylon, the goddess's temple remains a hollow echo of power, but the river sings still a song not for gods or kings, but for a single voice that dared to love and paid the price for it. Her name, once forbidden, now drifts on the wind, carried forever toward the sea. If this story moved you, remember every civilization hides its own buried truths, and the ruins still whisper what history tried to silence. Subscribe to Forgotten Stories, Ancient World, and uncover the hidden lives, forbidden rituals, and dark legacies that shaped humanity's past. The stories they erased are the ones that reveal who we truly are.